Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Samuel Zinner. How are you doing, Doctor?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing there in America?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Good.
All right, so today we're talking about Enoch and Utnapishtim. I know that there's a massive study and scholarship on Sumerian and Babylonian and other Mesopotamian influences on the biblical narrative, the Old Testament narrative. So, what's happening when we take a look at Enoch and Utnapishtim? What similarities do you see there?
Well, first I would say it's not always right a case of influence. Sometimes the similarities are to be explained by the fact that in the ancient Near East, right, there existed and circulated certain types of stories, and right, they came in a variety of versions. Like flood story, there'd be a variety of them. So some of them, most likely, more or less all of them, probably go back to a common ancestor, right, an original story that then branches out, right, and independently develops. So at that later stage, right, it's not necessarily an influence, right? But in any case, these similarities, when we talk about Utnapishtim, a name which means he found life, is basically an immortal, right, in the story. We in Genesis, right, there are actually two parallels. One is Enoch or Enoch, and the other is Noah, right? And this is classically told in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right, in an old Babylonian and Neo-Babylonian versions. But what we see in there is towards the end, like tablet 11, there's like 12 tablets, clay tablets. In tablet 11, the story of Utnapishtim is told. And so Gilgamesh, this king, royal figure, right, has traveled across the waters of death, and he meets Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim was the master of an ark that survived a great deluge. And after this deluge, Utnapishtim lives immortally. So he corresponds to two people, right? In Bereshit, or in Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, that's Enoch and Noah. Noah is the master of the ark, right? So he parallels Utnapishtim. But Enoch, the text says, Bereshit says, he walked with Elohim, that is the angels or the gods, and he was not, for God, Elohim took him, right? And I believe this is a hint at the immortality of Enoch. Not all scholars understand the Genesis text that way. They think that the later books of Enoch that tell the explicit story of Enoch becoming an immortal, right, was a later development. I believe it's already there in Genesis, and right, Hebrews no doubt believed it even before Genesis was written, as a widespread meme. So it's as if Utnapishtim in the Hebrew tradition is split into two different characters, right? And there's always a possibility, of course, I don't think it's likely, but there's always a possibility that Utnapishtim, right, was like a secondary fusion of what earlier, right, would have been represented by two different story characters. But I find that less likely than that there was originally, the story was that the person who was master of the ark and survived the ark lived immortally, right? And so that story character has been split into two different characters in Genesis, namely Enoch or Enoch and Noah. We could also say, point out actually Martin Schwartz at the University of Berkeley. You can find a PDF version of an article of his online for free. It's called Qumran, Turfan, Arabic Magic, and Noah's Name. Pretty comprehensive title there. But Schwartz lays out the philological steps in how the name Utnapishtim actually, right, from that is derived the Hebrew name Noah. And I won't go through the whole process, but the Utnapishtim, right, so the im, I-M in English, right, was falsely read as a Hebrew plural, and then, right, the T, or Tal remaining, was then falsely read as a feminine ending, so those get hacked off. But eventually, you whittle Utnapishtim down, and the Utna, right, so the N portion, the N phoneme, right, is what remains in Hebrew, in the Hebrew derivation. And so Utnapishtim is actually, right, that name is the origin of the later Hebrew name Noah, right? But again, there's this split, right? So this Utnapishtim is Noah, but he's also Enoch, right? So those two aspects of Utnapishtim have been separated into two different story characters in Bereshit, right? And some more parallels, right, go beyond Bereshit, right? Because Odysseus, right, in the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, this is an echo, a distant echo of the story of Gilgamesh, which includes the story of Utnapishtim. And then the 1001 Arabian Nights, right, rework this in its own way. You have there, let's see if my memory serves me correct, Bulakiya, the king of Israel, travels with a servant often, and he wants to find Suleiman, or Solomon's magic ring, so that he can then travel to the fountain of immortal life. Well, on his way there, he encounters this giant called Sharahiya, right? And that's an interesting name because it's actually derived from the divine name in Exodus, right? Ehya, 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 I will be who I will be, usually mistranslated as I am who I am, or I am what I am. But the Esher Ehya becomes Sharahiya in Arabic, and it's turned into a giant, right? But anyway, this Sharahiya guards the apples of immortality in a garden, right? So it sounds like Eden and the tree of life. And even though in the Bereshit story, the fruit of the tree of life is not, or the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not identified as apples, nevertheless, this sounds like what's going on, the apples as the fruit of immortal life. Sometimes I get confused between these two trees in the Genesis story, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, because there's this widespread idea that they're actually, that's one tree. When you boil it down, it's actually only one tree they're talking about. But be that as it may, when Bulakiya gets to this fountain of life, he meets Al-Qidr, which means the green man, basically, right? And so this is an immortal, like Utnapishtim. But he actually also corresponds to the prophet Elijah, right, in the Hebrew Bible, right? And Elijah also, according to Jewish tradition, right, is an immortal figure like Enoch or Henoch, right? So there are a lot of parallels there. Another one would be, right, when Gilgamesh finally gets to Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim's wife, right, is there, right? So Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of how he survived the deluge, the great flood, and now lives immortally there. And Gilgamesh wants immortal life, right? So Utnapishtim tells him, well, if you can stay awake for a week, you can have it. But of course, right, even though Gilgamesh is 3/4 God and, 2/3 God and 1/3 human, he can't stay awake, right? And so he basically tells Gilgamesh, go back to your city, go back to Uruk. But Utnapishtim's wife butts in and says, "Now wait a minute, tell him about that plant of immortal life." So anyway, Gilgamesh ends up with this plant of immortal life. He begins his return journey to his kingdom, but a snake, a serpent, who sheds his skin and is so therefore immortal, steals this plant of life. So, right, this is very similar to the story of the Garden of Eden and the two trees there, and Eve, right, playing a role in depriving Adam and, of course, herself in the possibility of attaining eternal life or immortal life. Right, so there's a lot of intermixing, right, of various levels of these similarities. Right, it includes this. Right, as I said, Gilgamesh is 2/3 God, 1/3 human. Right, so what does this remind us of? Well, in chapter 5 in Bereshit of Genesis, this is the account of Enoch. Well, chapter 6 famously begins with the story of the sons of the gods, or the sons of Elohim, who descend to earth, mate with human women, and give birth to the giants of old, the demigods, right, who are half divine and half human, right? So you have this, a rich variety, right, of transformations and reapplications, reworkings of the earlier stories in Bereshit, which is definitely the later of the two, right? So the Epic of Gilgamesh by far predates Bereshit, right, or the Book of Genesis. And what else could I say at first about the parallels? Well, there's also this, right? If we return to the serpent, right, in the story of the tree of life, the story of the Garden of Eden in Genesis, right, and then the serpent that steals the plant of immortal life from Gilgamesh, you will recall that in Genesis 3, verse 24, right, Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden, the Eden, and there is a cherub angel placed blocking the way to the tree of life, so that Adam and Eve cannot go to the tree of life, eat its fruit, and live forever. And this cherub stands there with a flaming sword. And the Hebrew is very difficult to understand, but it describes the physical movement of this sword, and it's rotating. I believe it was 2015 in the Journal of Biblical Literature that Murray Lichtenstein had an essay published where he explains that what the Hebrew text means there in Genesis 3:24 is that the flaming sword is rotating like a wheel. And so what's being hinted at there, the inspiration for this, is the scythed wheels of Persian war chariots. Right, so the sword is actually functioning as a wheel. So we have a cherub and a wheel. Now, if you think of Ezekiel chapter 1, the great vision of the divine Merkava, the divine war chariot with the wheels within wheels, the Ophan and the Ophanim. Now we can see this in Genesis 3:24. There's a cherub, and cherubim are also mentioned in Ezekiel 1. But there in Genesis 3:24 is a cherub holding a sword which represents an Ophan. So two classes of angels. There's a cherub and there's an Ophan, or a personified animated wheel angel. Right. So you have those two connections there. Maybe I'll throw in one final detail that also links Gilgamesh and Ezekiel 1. By the way, Ezekiel 1 is replete with parallels to Genesis chapter 1. But that is that the Akkadian word el-meshu is mentioned in both the Old Babylonian and Neo-Babylonian versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is the Akkadian word for amber. right? And in Ezekiel 1, there's a hapax legomenon, that it's a word that occurs there, that occurs nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. That's hashmal, right? This has become the modern Hebrew word for electricity, right? The ancient Greek translators, the old Greek translators, translated hashmal as in Greek as electron, right? But that means amber also in Greek, right? So this is an amber. And so you have that interesting, curious lexical link, right, between the Epic of Gilgamesh and Ezekiel. And a lot of people think that the Hashmal, right, that we can't know what this word means in Hebrew because it's not used anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. But it's clearly derived from the Akkadian El Meshu, right? So, which means amber. And that's the way the ancient Greek translators understood Hashmal. So we know what it means. It's amber, and it's bright, shiny, reflective. Yeah, like electricity. It makes you think of that, electrical sparks. And so I think it was naturally fated to become the modern Hebrew word for electricity. Anyway, so enough of the parallels there. Do you have any more questions, Jacob?
Why was Utnapishtim split into two characters, Noah and Enoch?
Who knows? I mean, it happens, right? Look at the worldwide art of storytelling. This often happens, right? And if you want to think of religious stories, I mean, you could think of the Gospels, right? There's a story of Jesus riding in on a donkey, right, into Jerusalem in one gospel, and the other gospel turns it into two, right? So it's a common trait of worldwide storytelling. But not only that, but in Bereshit itself, Enoch is split into two. There's a righteous Enoch and an evil Enoch, right? And a lot of people reading it think these are two different characters, and they function as two different characters, right? At the level of what we have. It's the finished book of Genesis. But behind these two, there's a single person who was named Henoch, and he gets split into and becomes two separate characters in the genealogies in the book of Genesis.
I guess what I was trying to ask earlier is what is the point of splitting him into two characters? Or did another culture already view him as two different characters, and so in the Hebrew tradition he became two different characters, or what do you think probably happened?
Well, it's really difficult. The only clue here, I believe, is this. If you look at Genesis 5, which has the account of Enoch, you'll see that paragraph, in a traditional Torah scroll, right? That passage is a genealogical table detailing 10 generations from Adam to Noah. It begins mentioning Adam or Adam, and has two instances of the divine name Elohim. The next divine name that occurs is in the record about Enoch, right? There's one instance of Elohim. There are two instances of Ha Elohim, the gods, right? But one instance of Elohim as God, right, in the record of Enoch. And then the next divine name, and the last one in there, is in the verse, I believe it's verse 29, that sort of implies an etymology for the name and a meaning for the name Noah. And that is that he was refreshed, or he rested. That's what the name Noah means. So the divine names are obviously, I think, pointing out that Adam, Enoch, and Noah are the most important of these 10 patriarchs. Right? And of course, Adam, right, is important as the founder, right, of the human race. But so we can connect anyone with Adam because he's their ancestor. But what links Enoch and Noah is this. The clue is this, that it tells us Enoch lived 365 years. It was his lifespan. All scholars recognize this is an allusion to the solar calendar, right, of 365 days, right? And sure enough, right, in later Jewish writings, like the Book of Enoch, the first Book of Enoch, it's preserved entirely in an ancient Ge'ez or Ethiopic translation, but we have a lot of Aramaic fragments that were recovered at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's an entire book of astronomy, or a calendrical book, right, in the Book of Enoch, right? And it's based on the solar calendar. And scholars usually refer to it as the Enochic calendar, right? The solar calendar is the same as the Enochic calendar, right? So there's a calendrical issue, right? A calendrical concern, right, behind this Enoch figure, right? And so Enoch is the seventh, right, in that list of 10 ancestors. He's the seventh from Adam. What's 7 mean calendrically? The Sabbath, right? So there must inhere in Enoch Sabbath symbolism. And I believe scholars, even traditions basically overlook this. Enoch is a symbol of the Sabbath in some way, but he's the seventh from Adam, so he's a symbol of the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is when God rested, according to the first creation account in Bereshit, right? And so how does that connect with Noah? Well, Noah's name, it is said there, right, means, it implies that it's repose or rest. Well, that's what the Sabbath is, right? Ideationally, right? So the connection between Enoch and Noah is the Sabbath rest, right? At least in Bereshit. And so it still doesn't answer the question, admittedly. So, well, why were they split in two, right? But even though they are split in two, I think the trace of there originally being a single story character, right, is there in that common link between them that hints at the Sabbath. But I really must repeat myself. This is a very common feature in folk tales and all types of stories in every culture on this planet. Characters get split into two characters become one become 10. I mean, all sorts of these things happen. So it's in the nature of storytelling and the need for variation. And then other needs or interests were at work that are just lost to us in the mists of history, so to speak, the vicissitudes of time.
I usually see scholars comparing Enoch to the Sumerian character Enlil.
Well, there is,
because he was
yeah,
taken up to heaven and he walks with the storm god Ishtar and Utu, the sun god.
That's right. So there's a parallel there too, and it shows you the variations, right, that crop up in these stories. Like Enoch, right, reflects not only an aspect of Utnapishtim, but it also reflects aspects of other characters, right, in these ancient Babylonian stories. So yes, there's no incompatibility between that. It's just another sign of this penchant for reworking stories in a multitude of ways. And it happens even in the same culture. I mean, if you trace the development of some of the Babylonian stories throughout time, you see these very similar reworkings. And things get morphed and sometimes turned upside down. Right? So you can look at Bereshit, right? Book of Genesis, chapter 1, right, to Genesis 2, verse 3. We have a first creation story. Then after that starts a second creation story. This is very different, right? So even in the same source there, you have a significant reworking, right, of the same basic story of creation, but I mean in a significantly divergent version.
Is there any other examples that you can think of right now that of Mesopotamian characters becoming more than one character in the Bible, as this happened elsewhere in the Bible? This is what I'm basically asking you.
Oh, wow. Not in the Bible, but here's another example. But it's probably not what you're looking for, but it overlaps with the same phenomenon in storytelling. For instance, in the Quran, there's a prophet named Idris, and tradition identifies him with the biblical Enoch. But as a matter of fact, at least in my considered opinion, Idris is just simply reflecting the Greek version of the name of Ezra, Esdras. And there's a metaphysis that happens there, and some phonemes get switched around in the sequence. So it goes from Esdras in Greek to Idris. So there's actually Ezra. But the thing about it is this, that what is said about Idris in the Quran matches the biblical story of Enoch. That is, he gets taken up to heaven and is put in a high station, right? A high heavenly station. So there you have a merging of Ezra and Enoch. And so where does that come from? Well, if you take a look at the Jewish apocalypse called For Ezra, you will see that the scribe Ezra, right, is given multiple Enochic traditions, right? So Enochic traditions or features of the Enoch story and person are applied to Ezra, right? And so Ezra has become, a very Enochic character. And so this explains how the Quran can use the name Ezra and yet as a name for really the character of Enoch, right? And I'm sure, one would just have to think, and the list would be not endless, but we would be in an endless search for these types of parallels and never coming up short, because it's a very common phenomenon in storytelling. As I said already, right? There's actually two Enochs in the book of Genesis. One is righteous, one is evil. Right, so you see it already there. As I said, one person becoming one donkey becoming two donkeys. Right, there, right, and sometimes characters or animals in one story might that are singular in an original version become plural in another story, maybe because of not having a good grasp of the language of the original story, right? So, as you know, in Hebrew, we can have nouns that have a plural ending, but they're literally, understood to be singular, right? So, like Chaim literally means lives, plural, but you don't translate it that way. It's translated as life. Right, so if you come across issues like that, right, and you can then misunderstand or intentionally exploit the fact that a noun has the form, the structure of a plural, and so you turn it into a plural in a new language as you retell the story. So there's a plethora of reasons why something like this could happen. And it's often, you can't trace it because these stories were being told for so long, for so many, not only centuries, but millennia, that we can't reconstruct the links in the chains, right? And the reasons for each link, right, in these chains of all the constant, transmogrifications, right, and metamorphoses, right, of story details.
What do you think of Bird Enoch when it refers to Enoch as Metatron, who is quote unquote the lesser Yahweh, according to that text?
Right. This is something that we read in the Hecalot text that has been called, right, the third book of Enoch. I think that's infelicitous, but it's been called the third book of Enoch. Written in Hebrew. It tells the story of Enoch being assumed into heaven, as he is in the first book of Enoch and the parables of Enoch. It's the 71st chapter, so-called. He's assumed there, and his body turns into a body of fire, right? He's basically transformed into this supra-angelic entity known as Metatron, right? And so that takes the story a little bit, but the genesis of it, if you will, right? You can see it already in the much earlier parables of Enoch, right? And it's not as explicit about his body turning, but he does get transfigured in some way, in a glorious way. And then this is the description, the power of the description, the liveliness of it, is heightened or deepened, right, in the second book of Enoch, which survives in Slavonic, probably originally written in Greek. Right, and so the later Hecalot text, known as, which scholars have been calling the third book of Enoch for about a century, right? It's even more dramatic, right? And then that's where we find first this name Metatron, right? So the super angelic Metatron, he's the lesser Yodevave, the lesser Adonai, right? And so this is a name, actually, we also find in a quote unquote Gnostic work, right? Called Pistis Sophia, right? Faith, wisdom, right? So it is an ancient idea, certainly, right? And so, but yeah, so you have these two powers basically, right? Yodevave as such, right? The greater Yodevave and the lesser Yodevave, who is the transformed patriarch Enoch. And it's an amazing story, but again, we have a lot of parallels, right, in ancient literature, ancient religious texts, and mystical texts and other kinds of texts. We have a lot of them where a human being, right, is raised to the heavenly heights, to the divine heights, and becomes transformed and is clothed in the divine name, even the Tetragrammaton. So not the same, but very similar to what is happening to Enoch in his transformation into Metatron. And although this story of Enoch's transformation into Metatron is very late compared to, let's say, the so-called New Testament, there is a similarity, right, in the structure of the story to what some early Christians believed about Jesus. Like Paul's letter to the Philippians, it's this famous, what's called the famous Christological hymn in the second chapter. And the model there is that Jesus existed in some divine form, comes to earth, dies, and then is raised to the heights and is given the name above all names. Well, that's the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God in Judaism, right? And so he, in some sense, the belief is he, in some sense, becomes like a lesser Yod He Vav He. I can explain that in a little bit more detail, right? This has been explicated, I think, recently by a pair of German scholars whose names escape me at present, but they pointed out that in that Christological hymn in Philippians 2, it emphasizes that Jesus, the Son, the Son in the pre-existent state emptied himself, right? Then this Jesus appears on earth and empties himself. He humbles himself in death on a cross. And for that reason, God exalts him to the point where God gives him the Tetragrammaton. Now, what that means is, as these scholars point out, is not only does the Son humble himself and so gets a new name, the Tetragrammaton, becoming like the lesser Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The Father in that hymn is also thought of as humbling himself. And how does he humble himself? He gives up his name, which is the Tetragrammaton, and he gives it to Jesus, which means that God, in that thinking, and it's outrageous to rabbinic Jewish sensibilities, but this is what this hymn is implying. God is no longer named Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, only the Son is. So God receives a new name, and what is that name? Ha-Pater, the Father. And that's why the New Testament never calls Jesus the Son of the Lord. He's the Son of God, because he can be the Son of the Lord if he is the Lord, right? So he becomes the Son of God. And this, you can tell, if you look at early Christian literature, this is for diagnosing or identifying which texts are quote unquote Jewish Christian and which texts are basically following the Pauline theology. For instance, in the letter of James, we know that's a Jewish Christian work because he refers to the Lord and Father. That is, the Father who is the Lord. Anyone following Pauline theology is not going to call the Father Lord. Only Jesus can be called Lord, right? In according to Paul's thought. And you can go through all the authentic letters of Paul and you will see that. Jesus, the Tetragrammaton or Kyrios in Greek is never applied to God, except when Paul might be citing a Tanakh verse, right? And the understanding then would be either that it was a prophecy of what was going to happen to Jesus inheriting the Tetragrammaton, or right, reflecting a time in salvation history, as it's called by the Germans, when God, the God of Israel, still had the Tetragrammaton as his personal name, right? So the lesser Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in that hymn is Jesus, and there really is no greater Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh left. He becomes the Father. It's pretty extraordinary if you think about it.
Well, thanks for joining me today once again, Dr. Zinner.
Sure, it's my pleasure always, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.